Hi, everyone. Thanks again for being here. My name is Megan Rydecki. It's my pleasure to serve as your director at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. If I have an extra big smile on my face, it's because, well, it's sort of bittersweet, but I'm fresh off maternity leave. It's my second week back in the office, so that's also my way of saying, if I screw anything up today, that's why. It's because I operate on very little sleep, but happy to be here, and my little buddy's at daycare and hopefully doing well today. But it's a joy to be back with you all. I love our events. I love this community, so thank you all for being here. I want to offer a special welcome to our Hauenstein Center members. Good to see many of you. Some of our advisory cabinets here. We've got Grand Valley students, GVSU colleagues, and also a very special welcome to some of our middle college friends from Wyoming High School. Go Wolves. You guys want to raise your hands? Very brilliant. If you go to Wyoming High School and you enroll in this program, after 5 years, you leave with your high school diploma and an associate's degree, which is so smart. Why aren't we all doing that? I don't know. But anyways, we look forward to seeing you next year when you all become Lakers for a lifetime and enroll at Grand Valley. So thanks in advance. And of course, we'll expect you to apply for the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. So if you don't know about that, come find us afterwards. We'd love to tell you more. Thanks again for being here. A couple special things that I want to talk about real quick before I introduce our leadership minute. Next week is a very special day. March 20 would have been Ralph Hauenstein's 113th birthday. And as you might imagine, the Hauenstein Center, our mission is to raise a community of ethical, effective leaders for the 21st century. And that was a direct edict from Ralph, who is the namesake of our center. He was the benefactor of our center. And he is the very incredible human who we try to emulate in everything that we do here. So next Thursday, think of Ralph. And shameless plug, it also happens to be Grand Valley's Day of Giving. So it's a special day where we encourage folks to think of the university, to support the work that we do, and especially the Hauenstein Center and the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. So if you're interested in doing that, you can, say a little silent thanks to Ralph for the good work he started, and you can help continue it as well. So with those announcements being made, at this time, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you one of our Cook Leadership Academy fellows to provide our leadership minute. And that would be Georgia Skarzinski. Let me tell you a little bit about Georgia. Georgia is a senior at Grand Valley State University majoring in supply chain management and marketing, distribution, and logistics. She's a lead fellow in the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy, where she's passionate about mentorship and leadership development. Georgia currently serves as vice president of the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals at GVSU, where she helps organize networking events, plant tours, and professional development events. Georgia's passionate about connecting students with industry professionals and helping bridge the gap between classroom learning and real-world applications. Her leadership approach emphasizes empowering others, promoting collaboration, and encouraging open dialogue to drive meaningful growth. Please join me in welcoming Georgia.
Good afternoon, Hauenstein Center members and guests. My name is Georgia Skarzinski. I joined the Cook Leadership Academy as a fellow candidate in my junior year and now serve as a lead fellow candidate in my senior year. However, my journey with the Hauenstein Center did not begin with the CLA. It actually began as a sophomore when I was a student assistant. When I arrived at Grand Valley, I was confident in my career path. I planned to pursue a career in podiatry as a foot and ankle doctor, actually. But despite enjoying my classes and professors, something didn't feel right. By the end of my freshman year, that feeling was undeniable. I knew I needed to explore other opportunities and majors at Grand Valley. That's when former Hauenstein Center staff member Rydecki encouraged me to apply for a position at the Hauenstein Center. Within a few weeks, I was working as many hours as possible and quickly found a true sense of belonging in the office. It was actually an event held by the Grand Rapids Chamber that I attended with the Hauenstein Center that inspired me to change my major to supply chain management, which is all about ensuring that the right products reach the right place at the right time. Though I knew little about the field, I soon realized how much I thrived in an environment that prioritized collaboration and problem solving. I pushed myself to join the Zinman Supply Chain Management Association and actively pursued a spot in the CLA. In March of my sophomore year, I received an email from students in the Supply Chain Association looking for a fourth team member to interview and compete on a team in an out-of-state case competition, which is a competitive event where teams of students analyze and brainstorm a solution to a real-world supply chain issue within a limited time frame. At first, I imagined how incredible this opportunity would be, but just as quickly, I snapped back into reality, telling myself, you're not ready, you're not smart enough, and there's no way you can do this. I jokingly brought up the email over my lunch break at the Hauenstein Center, expecting my coworkers to laugh at that opportunity with me, and instead, they were shocked that I hadn't responded. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming wave of support and encouragement, which is something I had never experienced before. That day, I decided to take a leap. I responded to the email, interviewed the next day, and then within a week, I was working on that case. For 2 weeks, my team and I poured everything we had into that case. We were staying up late meeting with professors and brainstorming the best solution possible. We then flew to Colorado State University, where we presented our solution in front of a panel of top supply chain professionals. That was in March of 2023. Today, I stand before you having competed in 3 case competitions, 2 out of state at Colorado State University, and 1 at General Motors headquarters. I now serve as the Vice President of the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, and last year I was fortunate enough to serve as the Vice President of the Association of Supply Chain Professionals. I was sent by Grand Valley's management department to attend one of the largest supply chain case conferences in the world as a brand student ambassador. I represented not just Grand Valley, but the entire CSCMP Great Lakes Roundtable in the Midwest. The moral of my story is this. I once believed that leadership was about confidence and power. Now I know that leadership looks like adaptability, resilience, and the willingness to take risks. It's about showing up with integrity, taking ownership of challenges, and continuously learning, especially when you're faced with uncertainty. But more than anything, I've learned that leadership isn't about the power you hold within yourself. It's about the power you see in others. The Hauenstein Center staff set an incredible example of this when they encouraged me to take on that opportunity that I did not believe I was ready for. Great leaders don't become great through their own confidence and power. They become great through empowering others. And that's why I now sit closest to these very doors at every single Supply Chain Association event, hoping to catch that next student who shows up feeling like they aren't enough, so I can instill in them the same confidence that the Hauenstein Center staff has instilled in me. My name is Georgia Skarzinski, and I am a leader. Thank you. And now I'd like to invite our panelists up to the stage.
Thanks again, everyone, for being here. We are really excited about this conversation. We have 3 remarkable political scientists who are joining us today. They are Kevin Portteus from Hillsdale College, Christina Wolbrecht from the University of Notre Dame, and our very own Donald Zinman from here at GVSU. So as we get started, you all know this is a Common Ground event, and I just want to remind us as we talk about political parties today, the point of our conversation is not to talk about who's right and who's wrong or who's better or who's worse, but today is really about sharing ideas, sharing information, sharing observations from our panel of experts so that we can better make meaning of what's going on in the world today, and our favorite part, know how we can show up as ethical and effective leaders in our own communities and figure out what to do with that. So, take and do with the information what you want, but again, just know that today is about learning and about thinking, and we can't wait to hear what some of the conversations will emerge after this. So that being said, we are going to dive right in. We have some prepared questions, and then as always, we will leave some time for the burning questions that you all will have, certainly, and we'll leave about 20 minutes for that at the end. So get those ready in your brain, and you'll have an opportunity in a little bit. So as we think about political parties, there is a lot that we can talk about, and we're already a little concerned that we're going to have more ideas than what we have time for. But to start us out, I'm simply going to ask, what one word would you use to describe the current state of our political parties? And certainly you are allowed to expound a little bit on that, but what one word? And I'm actually going to start with Christina first. Ladies first.
Sure. Well, thank you. It's just a pleasure to be here today. what a great turnout. What an active community. I'm really impressed. So thank you for having me. I think the word that I would probably use is transition. So the United States has had a two-party system almost from its founding. We've had the same two political parties since the 1850s. This is a period that's had, massive changes: industrialization, urbanization, 2 world wars, a civil war, other conflicts, terrorism, all these sorts of things, and we still have these two parties. And the reason we still have two parties is that parties are amazingly adaptable, that throughout our history they have remade themselves, remade their functions, how they do their work in response to changing economic, political, social sort of conditions. And we are definitely in a period, political scientists often note these particular periods of transition and change for the parties, and I don't think there's any question we're going through one of those right now.
Kevin?
Mine's going to be similar, realignment. And I think that we haven't, a realignment of the kind that I don't think we've really seen since the 1930s, and a really kind of, not just one party or another coming to power, but a fundamental scrambling of the coalitions, which is to say that groups are moving between parties in a way that they really haven't in decades, certainly not within my lifetime. In other words, you're seeing groups of people lifted out of the Republican Party, dropped into the Democratic Party. On the other hand, think about how many of the key players in the Trump administration are former Democrats, right? People like Tulsi Gabbard, people like RFK Jr., who are moving from one party to the other as the issues and the dynamics change.
Donald?
Thank you for inviting me as well. Pleased to be here. The word I would use is polarization. I think our party divisions, and this doesn't contradict anything my fellow panelists have said, because I think they're both right on target, but polarization, political parties reflect and magnify existing cultural divisions within this country between different demographic groups and between Americans with different cultural values. And the political parties very much reflect and magnify, or perhaps even worsen, those divisions.
Well, let's stay with that for a little bit and just talk about, what did we learn from the 2024 election about the makeup of each party? What has changed? What remains the same? And Donald, I'll have you continue with that.
If you're talking about what did the 2024 election reveal concerning the parties themselves as institutions and their voter base, it's that party loyalty is still very real in this country. That and maybe Republicans at the moment understand that a little bit better than the Democrats do. Trying to get moderate Republicans to vote for a Democrat is a very, 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 very hard thing to do. That I think it's to the point that I think it's fool's gold. And I think the Republicans are a little bit better at understanding that mobilizing and energizing your base of voters is the better ticket to winning. Versus trying to win over moderate Democrats, who in the end are going to vote with their party when all is said and done. So I think for everything that we've already said here, I think the party loyalty from voters is still very, very strong in the United States, and that you can still have that even as the parties are very much in a moment of transition, as we both talked about.
Other thoughts about 24?
Sure. I think a couple of things. I absolutely agree with everything that's been said so far. And I would just emphasize two things. In thinking about the changing coalitions, what we're seeing, again, none of this happens overnight. It's just like one election, everyone sort of switches, right? This is a process over multiple elections. And one of the biggest changes that we're only now starting to really recognize and see is the shift in the relationship between education and affiliation with the Democratic and Republican parties. And so when I was in graduate school 30 years ago, one of the great, rules, the consistence was the more education you had, the more likely you were to vote Republican. And Democrats were much more working class, people who didn't go to college, et cetera, et cetera. And we have really seen that change in the last 20 to 30 years. So that today, it's more or less the opposite. The more highly educated you are, the more likely you are to vote Democratic. The less well-educated you are, the more likely you are to vote Republican. Now, when I say that, that doesn't mean every person with a college degree votes one way or the other. I want to always remind you that we're talking about trends, et cetera. And it certainly doesn't mean that every person without a college degree votes Republican. But that's a massive reversal in our society that's really unprecedented, and we could talk about that for days and days. I think the other thing I want to point out that's important about the parties' coalitions that we really saw in 24 is how very competitive they are and how closely divided they are. And so we have elections that in some ways start to feel like coin flips, right? It just comes down to this many voters. When Trump won in 2016, it was from about 120,000 people across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, right? All you need to do, you don't even have to convince them to vote for either party. You just had to have those people stay home and things would have looked very different, right? And so it to what I would call like statistical, barely an error is enough to change the outcome of an election. It could have rained somewhere and a few people would have decided they didn't want to fight that to go vote. These things are going to have a really big impact. And I think Donald's exactly right to emphasize turnout then. Because you're right, no matter what they think about their party's nominee, more than 90% of Democrats are going to vote for their nominee and more than 90% of Republicans will vote for their nominee. And so who gets more voters out, I think, is really something key and that we really saw, I think, in 2024. I'll say one last thing. You're absolutely right? The Democrats tried so hard to get moderate Republicans in 2024. Mary Cheney going all over the place, right? Reaching out to all these disaffected Republicans. And I don't think there's much evidence that that was successful at all.
If I could pick up on something, Don, that you said about the durability of people's voter affiliations, I think that really affected, in some interesting ways, strategy this time around. I listened to a long interview with Charlie Kirk, who's this Republican organizer, and he said, for years and years and years, and I guess I can testify to this, the target demographic, the swing demographic that everybody wanted, suburban women, right? The soccer moms. These are the people we need to get. And what Kirk said was what we figured out was that getting every one of those votes required a very high investment in time and in resources. And so they said, okay, we're going to do something different. We're going to find low propensity voters who are ideologically aligned with us instead of looking at high propensity voters that we have to win over. So his organization starts showing up on college campuses looking for young men, right? People who are inclined probably to be more conservative, but don't vote very much, right? In Pennsylvania, Scott Pressler, the organizer, he's looking for hunters. Only 30% of these people are voting. They tend to be more conservative in the rural parts of Pennsylvania. We need to get these people out. Again, people that are already ideologically sympathetic, but low propensity voters. Let's get those people in. That takes a lot less resources in order to bring those people into the active voting coalition.
So that being said, ideologically aligned, let's talk about issues. What issues worked for the party in 24, each party's in 24, and what failed? And do you have any premonitions about what's to come for 2026 and 28 when it comes to issues?
Oh gosh, premonitions, I couldn't even begin, think about, before I do any premonition stuff, let's think about where we were 4 years ago, right? And in other words, all premonitions are invalid 20 minutes after they're stated because, I think that on the Republican side, it was Ron DeSantis was the guy among a lot of conservatives. And then I think the kind of, obviously the sitting president is going to run for re-election. Well, it didn't quite work out. I think that in terms of what worked and what didn't, Christina, I think you're right. The bringing the Cheneys into the fold, that just didn't work. And there's actually been a lot of interesting long-form journalism on how that didn't work, right? Economy and immigration, those things did work. I think those were very concrete issues that the Republican base was able to sort of rally around, and that ordinary people were able to understand and concentrate on.
So I think, some of the really long-term ideas about voting and political science are both what we call retrospective voting and pocketbook voting, which are usually quite related to each other. So retrospective means nobody knows, people say all sorts of stuff. Nobody actually knows what you're going to do when you're in office. And so the way that we judge the candidates is, well, how did they do in the past, right? Can I count on Democrats to do X? Can I count on Republicans to do Y? And what I think a lot of voters saw in 2024 is there had been this huge increase in inflation, and that gets to pocketbook voting, right? When you're going to the store, when you're buying gas, when you're buying milk, I don't even want to say it, but I will, when you're buying eggs, right? That's most of us aren't sitting around like, I wonder what the unemployment rate is, right? The way we understand the economy is we buy stuff and we get a sense of what's happening in our own household, right? And so around the entire world, when the COVID lockdowns ended, we had a surge in inflation. It turns out when a lot of people have been inside and you let them out, they buy stuff and they go places, and that raises prices, right? Fact is, the United States had a softer landing from that than many other countries. We sort of recovered for inflation sooner and with less sort of distress. But at the end of the day, Biden had been president when there was this high inflation. And in terms of retrospective voting, lots of people, you heard them say this, right? When Trump was president, we didn't have this high inflation, it was better. And now we do. And so I'd like a return to that if we get Trump back in office, we'll have the economy that we had before COVID, before all of this happened. And so I think that was a big piece. I think the perspective is really, I share, of course, that we explain, we don't predict. So I guess I wouldn't say, remember where we were 4 years ago. I would say, remember where we were 3 months ago, right? We have had such disruption in our economy, in our education systems, in foreign affairs, in sort of Social Security, you name it, that we're really in a period of enormous uncertainty. President Trump himself has said that we should expect a recession. Recessions are generally not good for presidents, but timing is everything and X, Y, and Z, right? And so I don't think, maybe you all are better than me. I'm not sure any of us could have predicted where we are today 3 months ago. And so it's very hard to know what to expect in 26 and in 28. I have lots more I would say about that, but I'll stop now.
The only thing I would add to what Christina said here about inflation is we as a country had not really had an inflation problem, and going backwards, you got to go back to about 1979, 1980. And a lot of Americans weren't even alive back then, much less adults. So we weren't really, as a country, used to all of the burdens of inflation. This was a very new thing for a lot of people. That a lot of you young people might have to have your grandparents tell you about the gas lines and the even worse inflation that we had in 1979, 1980. So this was a very new and disruptive and shocking phenomenon for a lot of Americans to endure. And it still wasn't as bad as what happened in 79, 1980. So in that respect, the damage was, it was on Biden and Harris's watch. And, inflation is, and the problems associated with it, brings about a whole different type of economic anxiety as compared to recessions. And we've all been through that before, but inflation is kind of a different animal that a lot of Americans weren't used to dealing with. And I think as voters, that made them very cranky.
It's worth saying, of course, that after 79 and 80, they also kicked the incumbent out and elected someone new.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
big time.
Inflation's not good for you. If you're an incumbent president, that's a.
So let's talk about President Trump a little bit. Some pundits are contrasting his very assertive leadership of the Republican Party with a seemingly directionless approach in the Democratic Party. How would you assess that characterization? We've seen a lot of people in the party line up behind President Trump. I think that was something that we saw during the election, certainly. Feels much more fractured and splintered with the Democrats. Is that true? Is that just an aberration that we see, or we think we see?
I don't think it's an aberration. I mean, I think the phenomenon is real, that Trump has at the moment, a very strong domination of the Republican Party. And that's not an unusual thing for presidents to have that degree of clout over their own party. I remember in the heyday of George W. Bush's popularity in his presidency, he had a very similar type of influence over fellow Republicans, and he could get pretty much anything he wanted from other Republicans in the Congress and down ballot. And as long as Trump has that popularity with the Republican base, I think that will continue. As for the Democrats, look, they have to go through this process. It's not fun. It's tough medicine, but it's a process that has to happen of finding new leadership and redefining what they have to offer to the American voter. And it can be kind of a painful, grueling process, but it has to happen if they're going to be a winning party again. It had to happen after, the 3 landslide defeats in the 1980s, and then coming upon Bill Clinton and then the DLC Democrats. It had to happen after, the 2004 when Republicans, swept the board and Barack Obama emerges as the new direction for the party. It's a painful process. The media can be very impatient about, and the media loves to say that Democrats are in disarray. They love to do that. But it's a process that it has to happen, and it's a process that's very normal for a party that has lost an election across the board, is going through these growing pains. And in order to find the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, you have to, stumble in the fields a little bit. I just made up that expression.
Right here. So I agree with all of that. And I mean, I go even farther, right? So Will Rogers famously said, I don't belong to any organized political entity. I'm a Democrat, right? So making fun of Democrats for being in disarray is goes back 100 years. And what also goes back 100 years is you can read stories in the 20s where they're basically journalists were saying the Democratic Party has basically ceased to exist as an opposition party in the United States. But of course, Franklin Roosevelt gets elected in 1932, and we have Democratic dominance of national politics in the United States for the next 50 years, right? And so this is what I mean when I say parties are adaptable. There's nothing that gets parties to adapt more than losing, right? And that's the sort of thing that gets you up in the morning and what voters and what sort of leaders, et cetera, et cetera. I think the two parties have very different challenges right now. So it's absolutely true that there's a lot of unification under President Trump, and absolutely, I used to show my students in the 2002 elections, I have all these screenshots. Every single Republican candidate for the House got a picture of themselves with George Bush, right? He was so popular after 9/11, and that was really effective. Then they all ran away from him in 6, right? So this is how these things change. I'll start my step into a little controversy. I think this is different somewhat of a nature. One is there's no question that you hear from, including Republicans on the Hill, that they are scared, that they get death threats, that it's not just it's great to be seen with him because he's really popular. It's the fear of being primaried, but also other kinds of fear that we're really moving into a different kind of politics in that way. And so I think for the Republicans, it's who aren't Donald Trump, how to sort of assert Congress's place and how to sort of serve their own constituents and all those sorts of things within a completely remade Republican Party that is definitely Trump's party. Eventually, he will be gone from politics, if it's 4 years or 20, and the Republican Party will kind of have to figure all of that out. But you can't really blame them for riding the wave while they can. I think Democrats' problem is different. When you're elected to Congress, we choose people who are good in rooms like this, who know their local communities, who reach out to their constituents, and then we send them to Washington where they sit in so many boring meetings, and they make fundraising calls, and they legislate and they compromise. And so the people we've sent to Congress are good at those things for the most part. The problem is Democrats are in the minority, and Trump is acting outside of Congress entirely, right? So all these court cases about whether or not a president can just eliminate programs that Congress has created or change the board when change budgets when the Constitution says that Congress has the power of the purse, right? All those sorts of problems. And I think Democrats' problem is right now, this is a different game and they haven't figured out how to play it yet. That what's needed now is not, oh, we're in the minority, there's not much we can do, but a public communication, alternative plans, whatever that looks like. And thank God I'm not a member of Congress because I don't know what that looks like either. So I don't think it's just the party's coalitions are changing. I think that we're in a period, in some actually quite problematic ways, that politics itself is changing and the parties have to find ways to adjust to that and represent the issues and groups that they care about in this new political reality.
I want to take off a little bit just from what each of my colleagues said. As far as Trump being a unifying force, I would say Trump being a unifying force right now, let's come back and sit down together in 6 months or 12 months and see what that looks like. In other words, he's got a sort of ferocious amount of energy that comes from the combination of his electoral victory and him and his people. This is a very interesting phenomenon which none of us have been alive for. He and his people got 4 years to sit it out and see what they would, and think about what they would do, plan what they would do if they got another bite at the apple. And then they got another bite at the apple, right? So there's this ferocious amount of energy, but that's now it's on a big scale right now, but it's something that you often see with new presidents. They win, they come in, they've got energy, they want to do things, their party's behind them because that president just carried them to victory. How well does that hold up over time? How well does that hold up over events, right? What if some new foreign policy crisis comes up? What about this? What about that, right? Who could predict things like COVID and so on? That said, if I can come back on the Democratic side to earlier on I mentioned FDR in 1932. What followed 32 was a real just kind of gutting of the Republican Party at the intellectual level, right? So the intellectual historian George Nash says that in 1945, there's no such thing as a conservative intellectual movement, right? It doesn't exist. It's cranks, it's birchers, it's malcontents, right? It doesn't exist. You don't start to get that really until the early 1950s. Bill Buckley, Russell Kirk, right? It takes a long time, and it's early. But what we're seeing in the Democratic Party, it feels to me, now contrary to what my kids think, I was not alive in the 1930s, but it feels like that, right? And my kind of visualization of it is how Democrats reacted to Trump's speech, right, last week, right? That kind of performative resistance, but then what, right? And a poll I read a couple of days ago, and I think it was in the Hill, but they didn't do it. It was like Bluefield or something. 64% of the electorate polled said that they believed Democrats either had a bad plan for dealing with Trump or no plan. And that's a really hard place to be in. Now look, who knows what the time frame might look like, but it sure looks like they're heading into a period like that. So like what Republicans experienced after the New Deal.
Kevin, I like the question that you just posed, but then what? And I want to turn this a little bit. I think that's what a lot of the folks in this room are wondering about, but then what? I talk to a lot of people, some here who don't feel like their party represents them anymore, the party despite the loyalty, that maybe the issues that they cared about, that they traditionally relied on their party to represent them on, that's not the case anymore. So maybe it's fiscal conservatives who believe in marriage equality, or pro-life individuals who also, really care about climate change, issues that traditionally would fall along the spectrum that don't feel like that anymore. What are voters to do when they feel like their party is no longer their home?
Well, I would say that political parties, especially when you have a two-party system as opposed to a multi-party system, political parties are meant to be an amalgamation or a coalition of a lot of different interests and demographic groups and even people with different issue positions. The whole idea of a political party that aims to achieve the support of the majority is everybody has to compromise a little bit on some of, their issues that are important to them. And I know some people don't like to hear that. Some people view any compromise at all as capitulation and a sign of weakness. That's kind of a problem. But political parties are meant to be large organizations made up of, frankly, diverse individuals and demographic groups that might disagree on some issues, and that means everybody under the tent has to compromise a little bit in order to get to a place where the party can win. Because when you win, you get to govern. It's hard to make policy change when you're on the bench and you're on the outside looking in. When you get to govern, at least you have a seat at the table. Because if you lose, you're just sort of on the outside looking in and shouting and complaining, or you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. So political parties demand compromise, and nobody is ever going to be 100% satisfied with either political party, much less their own. And I know that might not be what people want to hear, but that's the reality of party politics in this country.
I don't mean this quite the way it's going to sound. I think we imagine that we grow into adulthood and we have values and policy preferences, and we think that Social Security should be privatized, or abortion should be illegal, or our foreign policy should favor one side or the other, whatever that is. And then we look out and we say, well, there are two political parties, and I'm going to choose which party best represents my well-reasoned political views. It's not that never happens, but it's certainly not the modal way in which partisanship is developed by individuals in the United States. When we are growing up, we are part of a community, and as part of our socialization is to figure out who are people like us, who's our group. Maybe it's a particular faith tradition or denomination. Maybe it's an ethnic group. Maybe it's a social class. Maybe it's immigration status. And one of the things that we learn as we're growing up is that people like us, like my family, are Democrats, or people like us are Republicans. Surveys of children as young as 8 say, oh, yeah, we are Democrats. If you ask them, what party, right? And the we is really important, right? Now, sometimes people grow up in a particular faith tradition, and when they get older and learn more about the world, they decide, I don't really believe that so much anymore, or I want to take a different, right? So they might change their faith. And I know lots of people are like, are you just describing faith as being like partisanship? Again, I'm a pastor's kid. I swear to you, it's okay. But they're not that different. They're not that different. Instead, right, and the same thing happens. Some people grow up and they're like, I'm not going to be a Democrat like my parents, right? I've seen the light and I'm going to be on the other side. But that's a deeply rooted identity. Most people, whatever they identify with when they're 18 will be what they identify with when they're 85. That's just that's an empirical observation. Most people stay with the same party their whole lives. And what we see poll after poll is that that partisanship then shapes how we view the world. I don't know really anything about trade policy, but if the leader of my party says this is the right thing, I'm more inclined to believe it. Now, maybe if I work in trade and I know better, I might be like, no, I'll tell you what, right? But in general, the world is complicated. There are lots of other things to do than pay attention to politics. I'm going to tell you right now, coming out on a Thursday afternoon to hear about politics makes you guys really weird. It's just not a normal thing to do. And we can say that because we did this professionally, for God's sake. So we're really weird. Right? And so we see parties become kind of a lens through which we see the world, which means that changes in party identification are really hard. So it's not that issues don't matter, but I think if I was going to describe 24, I would say retrospective voting before I would say the party's issue positions were so different. The last thing I'll say about that is, so I study women in politics and women voters for a living, and everybody said, post-Dobbs, we're going to have this huge, switch of women going towards one party, going towards the Democrats over abortion. And that absolutely did not happen. If this was a PowerPoint, I would bring up a post I had before the election in which I predicted this would not happen. My only prediction, and I was right, I want to point out. That's because people don't vote in terms of, most people, there are some people, but most people don't vote in terms of one issue, right? And the economy usually swamps almost all other considerations. People want to be able to take care of their families, right? And survive to another year. So again, I'm talking in generalities. That may not be your experience, that, et cetera, et cetera. But so I think when we think about the future, we have to think about, what values and what partisanship and those sorts of things that we're passing on to new generations. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, the system itself, going all the way back to its origins, is basically designed for fragmentation, right? The framers of the Constitution, they looked at the old small r Republican model. And the old small r Republican model, like the Greek city-states, right? Really tiny. And the theory was you have to have homogeneity in your population. They have to have the same interests. They have to have the same opinions. Otherwise, you're going to have factional conflict. It's not going to work. And so what Madison says in Federalist 10 is that's impossible. You can't do that. So let's build the country bigger with the expectation that there's going to be fragmentation, and that what that's going to do is prevent any one group who has nefarious ideas from getting in power and keeping power long enough to act on that. And if we fast forward a couple of years, Madison then circles back around and says, oh no, this worked too well, right? And so you actually get, from Madison himself, the creation of the first real political party in the United States about 1791 as a coalition of people who are opposed to Alexander Hamilton's public finance and economic programs. And so, just because the system is designed that way, to get back to the original question, you're always going to have people who fall through the cracks, right? You're always going to have people whose sort of spectrum of positions doesn't necessarily line up in a two-party system. And you can say, well, we should do a multi-party system like the Europeans. That has its issues also, right? And so, if we kind of wanted to get way off topic, we could do that, but yeah.
So I've got one more question. We'll try to keep it tight, and then we're going to move to Q&A. So if you have a question, look for the roving mics, and we'll get to it in a couple minutes. We had something called the Civil Discourse Symposium with our colleagues at the Padnos Sorosik Center for Civil Discourse last fall, called Gen Z Voices, If I Were President. And the crux of that conversation was polling our Grand Valley students and saying, if you were president, what would you care about? What would be important to you? And a topic that came up as a concern was money in politics. And I have to tell you, I asked this to the panelists the other day on a call, and they kind of laughed at me a little bit. But let's talk about power and money. Do we believe the parties remain committed to the best interests of the American people? I think that's what we want to believe. But is it really about money and power? And maybe you guys are going to tell us another thing we probably don't want to hear. But what's the relationship of money and power when it comes to the party system? And how should we think about that?
Which one matters more? Yes. Can I do that? Does that? No, look, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt. And if I can sort of, again, rewind, I remember in 2000 when George W. Bush refused federal campaign money. And he did so because he was convinced that he could raise more money on his own. And he raised something like, and I'm going to get the number wrong, but I'm in the ballpark, $85 to $100 million.
Oh, wow.
Okay? And that was blockbuster money. And now we're measuring national campaigns in the Bs, right? Not the Ms, the Bs, right? In billions. And yeah, we've had some inflation. We haven't had that kind of inflation, okay? So the money that has poured in, and again, if you want to play the comparative game, don't even get started on comparing that to, say, elections in European countries, where the money is like I carry that around in my pocket kind of money. And so, yeah, the money is gigantic. I do think that, I don't think that people are so cynical that, you think about an average person, right? If I get somebody that calls me up, right? The Hauenstein Center calls me up and says, hey, we want you to come out and do this thing, we give a little money. But if the other voicemail, when I come back from lunch, is from my wife, I'm going to call her first, right? In other words, there's still, and I think that, your congressman's a human being too, right? And he's going to respond to incentives now on a grander scale. But I think there is still a sense, and I think that if you talk to them and really get into it, they are concerned about the public interest. But there's also an enormous amount of money that sort of gloms onto the different sides, and that's true on both sides.
So I think one of the brilliant things about the Madisonian system was that it was supposed to structure ambition, right? So Madison starts with the idea that people are always going to be ambitious for power. The question is, how do you design a system that puts that ambition to work for the people, right? And so the idea of elections every 2 or 4 or 6 years, whatever it is so that if I'm ambitious, if I want to get ahead, it's in my best interest, not because I have lofty ideas. We'd like that if that was true. And sometimes it is. It absolutely is. But because I need to serve these people and do right by them, or they won't reelect me. So my power is now tied, my ambition is now tied to meeting the needs of our constituents. That is literally how our system works. That's the entire idea of it. The problem is, as Kevin rightfully has been saying, is that we've really become divorced from that, right? And so if you imagine that most of your constituents don't pay that much attention, maybe only a couple of issues, you can do whatever you want on all these other issues people aren't paying any attention to, right? And it might be that a few people are paying attention to those issues and they're really, really wealthy, right? And as Kevin has said, the problem of managing within a free speech system, the campaign expenditures and campaign spending has vexed 200 years of Americans. Mark Hanna, the great political organizer at the end of the 19th century, said there are 2 things that are important about politics. One is money, and I don't remember what the other one was. And he basically made the modern Republican Party by bringing it together with industry and all these sorts of things. There's always been loopholes. I've been teaching about campaign finance since before the current loopholes. Money finds a way. It's kind of like, nature. But as Kevin said, we're in a whole nother realm right now in how much money. And it's not just that how much money, it's that it used to be that rich people in general had a bigger say. But now the mega rich, Elon Musk spent how much money on this election, right? That can have all this influence and run all these, at some point when you don't pay that much attention and that's all you're seeing is the ads and the things that they created, I think it's gotten even worse. I think now there's ties between the wealthy people who own newspapers and how they're going to cover different administrations. That makes me very worried about future elections, among other things, right? And so there's never been a civilization in the history of the world where people with more resources weren't able to exact power over others. And it has always been the great challenge of democracies to find ways to manage that. Let me say that my last comment will be, it's not just, you were comparing to Europe. It's not just our campaign finance laws because of the First Amendment. You basically, if you're going to spend the money yourself, you can spend however much you want and buy up any ads you want, blah, blah, blah. There's other parts of our elections that are like this, right? So we have set times for our elections. Yay, that's great. But it means that our campaigns go on forever. Forever, right? Like how long was the Trump, Biden, Harris thing? Forever, right? We have two stages of elections because our parties now, in the name of democracy, have elections to choose who their nominees are going to be, right? If you're Germany or the UK and the government calls a new election in 6 weeks, there's only so much money you can burn through. Yeah. But when you have American elections that go on so long, all that TV time, all that stuff, all those consultants who God knows what they're doing, right? That all just costs money. And so it's a really broad structural problem, but I do think it's a problem.
Donald, is it okay if you've got a hot take, go for it?
I'm sorry, you said to be short and I was...
No, it's fine. I would love to say your piece and then we'll move to Q&A.
I think in many ways, I think the effect of money in campaigns is overrated. Obviously, you need some money to get your message out and communicate what you stand for. You need some money to get off the ground, but there does reach a certain saturation point where whether you have 1 billion or 1.5 billion really doesn't matter anymore. And I think the Harris campaign very much reached that. And like I said before about partisanship, you can drop into, if you're a Democrat and you drop into the middle of Alabama and spend $1 billion, gazillion dollars on a campaign for U.S. Senate, you're still going to lose because it's Alabama and it's a Republican state. And maybe just spending a gajillion dollars means you'll lose by a little bit less than a regular Democrat would lose. So there does reach that law of diminishing return, at which point saturation money just doesn't matter anymore.
I want to agree with that. But I want to say, I know you want to get to other questions.
She can sense
I have great
me.
passion about this. I think the problem now is that if you have maybe you're not going to drop a Democrat into Alabama, but you're going to find a Republican who's more consistent with those business interests and the money to challenge an incumbent Republican, right, as a Republican. So sometimes we see that sort of within there as well. But your point is well taken. It's also worth saying that incumbency rates in the U.S. House and Senate are so very high that many have argued these guys are really in control, right? You can turn to someone and say, if you support me, I'm going to be Speaker of the House. I'm going to be chair of Judiciary. I'm going to be chair of whatever you care about. And I'm not going to lose election. 95% of us get reelected. And so I'm going to need to, if you want me to listen to you, I'm going to need you to support my campaign in these sorts of ways. So it's definitely complicated. I appreciate your point. Okay, I'm done.
Excellent, Christina. Thank you. Let's turn to the audience. Who has a question?
Hi, I'm a student of international relations here at Grand Valley, so this is very fascinating for me. And when you mentioned that maybe not going to a multi-party system in Europe would be beneficial for us, I'm wondering if you can expand upon that, because it seems like it would allow more minorities and diverse sectors of all Americans to be better represented versus the kind of lockdown system that our two-party system of the US currently has. So why would you say that it's not beneficial to move that in that direction?
I guess since I rolled that one into the room, I'll say.
I was about to say
Everybody's looking at me like, oh, yeah, it's your problem. No, and I'm not a comparativist by any stretch of the imagination, but processes matter. And the system that we have, at least at the election stage, tends to, on the one hand, encourage compromise within electoral groups, right? The German election that happened last month is an example of this, but if you really want to see multi-party off the rails, last year's election in the Netherlands, we've got like 900 parties and they're all getting tiny fractions of the vote. And then you end up with, what that means is that nobody has any incentive to compromise on anything, right? If I don't like what this little party that gets 5% of the vote is doing, I'm going to take my ball and go home and make my own party, right? And then I'm going to take all of my positions and my little group. And you literally had in the German elections last month a party which got close to the threshold in that election, literally named after the person that bolted from the other party. You had this kind of populist leftist who formed this party, just named it after herself, right? And got 4, 5, 6% of the vote. And so what you don't get is what you do get in our system, which are, for the most part, not always, but you get clear winners, clear majorities, right? And our system tends to encourage that. What you don't get here are also months-long protracted negotiations over coalition building, right? And and when you pair that with the kind of mixed party list system that a lot of these European countries have, what you get in a lot of cases is you go to the polls and there's a significant change in the electorate and nothing much really changes, right? Which I think is what you're getting in Germany, right? There's a significant change in the electorate, but the coalition that's going to rule is not really going to change anything.
So I'm going to put one addendum on that, which is I would say we do have a long, protracted period of coalition building, and they're called primaries.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? And so the fight over, I mean, I'm not
Yeah,
disagreeing,
you're
but
good. No, that's fine. Disagree.
but so within the Democratic Party, labor and women and civil rights and people, I don't want to call them social liberals, but right, people who care about various sort of social issues like abortion, et cetera, have to kind of negotiate through a series of primaries, through who different funders are going to support. And again, we keep switching between Congress and the presidency, which are very different processes. But nonetheless, right, and on the Republican side, social conservatives and fiscal conservatives and deficit hawks and foreign policy hawks all have to sort of figure out through that process what their compromise candidate is going to be, right? Who's going to be their leader, et cetera. I do think the consequence is that when you vote for a candidate in a primary, you're not saying, I'm voting for this candidate because I care about organized labor and working people. You're just voting for that candidate, right? And so the vote here is much less informative in that way, whereas in multi-party systems that form their coalitions after government, you can say 30% of our coalition is green and 20% of this is X and Y. Then the last thing I'll say is I will at least give Germany credit in this way. When you have multi-parties that are more used to being in coalition with each other and switching around, you've set an example, right? So there was a very strong right-wing party in Germany, and all the other parties said, we will unite against that party. Whatever happens, we're not bringing them into, now it's a little more complicated than that, but that is basically saying, we disagree on all this other stuff, but we are not bringing the Nazis in, basically, right? And so, as we've been talking about, there have been no Republican elite wanted Donald Trump to be the nominee in 2016. Mm-hmm. The voters wanted that, right? But they had no way to there could have been Trump Republicans, there could have been, economic Republicans, social conservatives, that could have sort of worked with each other when they wanted someone different, which all the elites did in 16. I'm not saying they feel that way now. And one might even be more impressed with Trump's accomplishment by becoming elected, despite the fact that the powers that be were against him. But we just didn't have those same mechanisms.
Can I jump real quick? Because this is really good, and this is something I literally just thought of. I think that when you're talking about the primary process, the election in our system is kind of the end of that process, whereas in the multi-party systems,
exactly.
The election is the beginning of the process. Now, the issue that you run into, and I'll go back to that Dutch election, is that for months, you have no effective government.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're in that coalition negotiation process. You have a caretaker government. They can't do anything.
Yep.
And okay. Right? And what's funny, by the time you get done with the negotiation, the issues in the coalitions may have changed entirely. So, sorry,
Next question.
I wonder if you could address the polarization of the news media and how they cover things. They seem to be much more polarized than, say, even 20 years ago. And the other issue is the loss of influence of the newspapers and broadcast media. And now many people are getting their news from TikTok and Facebook.
Donald, do you want to start?
I think what we're seeing happen with the media is that, first of all, your initial point that the media is becoming more partisan and ideological, I think it's hard to refute that. There is in this country a long history of an overtly partisan news media. That in the 19th century, all the newspapers were partisan. They were openly, explicitly affiliated with political parties, even funded by political parties. And the notion of professional objective journalism didn't even exist.
is also the last time we were anywhere close to as polarized as we are today.
Exactly. And in a different way, in a 21st century way, we're moving back towards that, where the cable news media and podcasts and news websites are, pretty much sympathetic with or openly affiliated with a political party, where there's a very strong nexus between that party and the broadcasting that goes over the air or onto people's computer screens. So taken in historical context, it's not all that surprising to see that happening. And the fact that especially younger people are getting most of their news through social media is only going to encourage the political parties to adapt their message for an audience that listens to podcasts or even Facebook is becoming outdated in some ways. That's almost like the social media venue for older people to get pictures of their grandkids or something, which is fine, nothing wrong with that. But the younger generation that likes the podcasts and TikTok, the parties need to adapt their messaging in a way that's compatible for that venue. In 2024, the Republicans were a little bit ahead of the game on that.
I guess one thing I would add is these are all related problems. So I think one of the biggest challenges for the media right now is the massive concentration of wealth, right? That all of our laws and things that tried to work against monopolies, against control by one, have really been weakened in the last 50 years. And what that means is that local newspapers and local news stations are dying because most of them have been bought up by major conglomerates that aren't invested in their cities. They get a lot of their material from some national place instead of local. And so your ability to even understand what your member of Congress is doing, what events he was at. I actually saw a research paper recently that someone had showed that once you get these companies owning these local news stories, the members of Congress have less incentive to come into town and open a new building, appear at a Kiwanis meeting, whatever it is, because there's nobody to cover that. There's nobody to tell your constituents, I'm here, I'm interacting with people. So there's only the national media. You know how you get national media? You say crazy stuff on the Capitol steps, right? And it's made into a TikTok or it's made, so the incentives are really problematic. And so we talk a lot about, this, the increasing wealth of the very top and stagnation of the bottom, but this is literally having all these downstream effects on things like the news media.
I think it's also there's a lament in there, but there's also a possibility, right? That is to say, in the last several months, and I think I'm too old for the target demographic, but maybe not. I've done a lot of podcast listening. And so I had a nice long drive up here this morning, and I got to listen to a long interview with the Prime Minister of Qatar, right? And that's something you would never get, to have an interviewer pick his brain for 2 hours. You simply can't do that in TV format. You can't do it and to get it unfiltered, right? So there's no editing. It's just, here it is. We turn the camera on. I'm going to talk to this guy, right? And, and really get into somebody's head. And that really, I think, is you get a look at somebody that you would never get otherwise. And the way this was done in the past, in the pre-technology era, were things, if just an example, the Lincoln Douglas debates, where you get somebody who speaks for 60 minutes, 90 minutes, longer than that. And to be able to talk like that, whether it's a speech or an interview, for that length of time, you really get a chance to assess a person in the way that you couldn't before. So there are possibilities there as well. In other words, for unfiltered, for getting in depth with something or with somebody. So,
thank you. Very unfortunately, I know there's more questions. I'm so sorry, Professor Sanders, but I think we are out of time for today. I know it flew, right? I want to thank our panelists and our guests. I want to thank. Thank you. To the Hauenstein Center team and the Conference and Event Services team, thank you for the great service and the hospitality today. Thank you all for making time, for being weird with us on a Thursday and having these conversations. We think they're important. We think that you showing up and being part of this is important, and we're just grateful for the way that you show up civically in our communities. Quick reminders again, think of Colonel Ralph Hauenstein next Thursday. Think of Grand Valley and the students that you support here. And also be sure to join us on April 10 when we partner with the Kauffman Interfaith Institute to have a conversation about how we approach poverty. So with that, these brilliant people may be willing to stay and have a conversation with you afterwards. Otherwise, look them up. They are writers. They are contributors. They have a lot of great content that's out there, amazing books. So be sure to do that, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thanks.